How we doing, folks? Your host Moose here on the Pitt Panthers Football Network as we welcome you back to another Around the NCAA recap. Your Pitt Panthers were on the bye this week, but that doesn't mean we don't still have things to talk about here in Pitt football land. So this is going to be our Around the NCAA Week 8 recap show. And for the Panthers, while they weren't on the field, it was a busy week on the recruiting trail. And that ended up with a couple of commits for the Panthers. Two guys that were really close to committing. They both visited during Pitt's victory over Virginia Tech just a couple of weeks ago, but they finally decided, you know what, I've considered all my other offers and I want to come to Pitt. And that's going to be Victor Scott, 4-star middle linebacker out of Washington, D.C., and Josh Childress, 4-star defensive end out of Virginia. So we can see both of those guys committed to the Panthers this week. We also did have one recruiting board commit decide to go to Temple. He's actually a Pittsburgh, PA product, so local product, but running back. Didn't really need a running back. The Panthers don't. They're going to have at least 4 coming back next season. But we're interested in him, potentially see what he would do. Decided to let him go to Temple. Didn't really recruit him that heavily or put any points on him, though he was on the board. But Victor Scott, 4-star middle linebacker, decent size. We'll have to see what they look like because with our house rule, the only 4 stars and above that we're allowed to scout are Pennsylvania players. So in-state guys are we allowed to scout if they're 4-star and above. Anybody else that's 4-star and above, we're not allowed to scout. And then scouting as far as pipelines and stuff, I think it's 3 stars. We can scout if they're a pipeline player. If they're not a pipeline player, we can't scout them. And then below, 2s and below that, you can scout anybody, is the way our rules are working. But if we look at Steven Weber, +5 overall, 94 speed, actually would have been a good depth running back. Maybe grow into a player in a couple of years. But alas, we'll see what he does at Temple. Victor Scott here, 81 speed, 85 acceleration, 51 agility is really, really bad. So 71 tackling as well, 62 hit power. Not a great tackler for a middle linebacker, even though he's listed as a run stopper. But he is a good runner, so maybe he can develop those skills as we move forward. Childress, we can see, number 6 rated defensive end in the country, 4-star, projected at a 72. We're going to get our first bit of scouting on him. Pretty much all athleticism stuff. And again, very low agility, not great strength. Acceleration's okay. Hit power 71. That could come up a little bit, but kind of a downside there for Childress as we look at him so far. So 2 guys that will be coming into the team next season, but not the best overall so far. Danny Leonard will get to finish out his scouting since he is signed. We can finish him the whole way. He's 50% signed because, again, 4-star player, we weren't allowed to scout him to start off with, so we can go the rest of the way. We already know 91 speed, so he moves very well. He's got decent tackling, good hit power. His catching is okay as well. So receiver, safety, corner, somewhere in there, depending on how the rest of his ratings shake out. And he looks like a pretty all-rounder, you know, decent. His man coverage could be better. His zone is better than his man, but his press is the best. So could be a good press corner or maybe a safety if you put him in zone because he's a decent tackler. He's got good pursuit ratings. He's really kind of an overall player. 72 overall, so not a gem, not a bust. Decent player to come into the team. Can't complain in that regard when you bring a 4-star in. You know, same thing with Scott and same thing with Childress. They have the pedigree, but unfortunately the overall ratings maybe aren't jumping off the page as you just have to find a good place to let them develop and let them work into the team. So I like the signing of Leonard. He definitely looks like a good player. We'll see what Scott and Childress look like when we fully scout them and get them completely developed and found out for where they're going to fit into the team moving forward. But if we look at our overall class so far, we have 7 signings in, 22 more guys on the board as it stands right now. We'll see. Obviously, the way we run our Dynasty here is we have 13 seniors in our class, 70 total roster spots, so we have 1 free roster spot, which is 14 players. So we're going to go 14 signings are available spaces, and then we have to factor in possibly guys going to the NFL draft, guys transferring. So I'd like to sign 14. I should say the number of available spots that we have on the roster plus an additional 2. So we have about 16 scholarships, which means we have 9 available at this moment in time for players on the team. And, you know, we'll see who that's going to factor in. You can see we have a ton of different prospects who I've shown the top of the list before. A couple of big names, so we'll see who ends up coming into the team as we move forward. But around the ACC, the games last week, Panthers were off, but still plenty of things factoring into the standing. North Carolina beats Miami, so they go to 3-1, which keeps them alive for the ACC Coastal Division title, as they still have us to play later in the season. Syracuse beats FIU, Virginia beats Duke, Virginia Tech with a win, NC State knocks off Louisville, so they go to 3-1, still keeping themselves in the hunt for the ACC Atlantic, behind Clemson, who ended up with a huge victory there over Florida State, 41-34 for the Tigers, keeps them on the track for the ACC Atlantic Division crown, as Florida State was really their main competitor because the Seminoles have looked very strong this year, and Clemson needed a couple of late touchdowns from Will Alford to take the lead back. Florida State tried to rally, but were unable to do so, ran out of time, and it was a big victory for Clemson. In the top 25, we take a look around the country. Texas 45-28 over Houston in what's now a Big 12 matchup, of course, with the Cougars moving to the Big 12 for this season. South Carolina, big ranked match against Tennessee. They come away with a 30-17 victory. Baylor 47-35 knocks off number 5 Iowa State and quarterback Michael Robinson. Just offensive flowing as you expect in Big 12 football, and Baylor 16 points in the fourth quarter allowed them to pull ahead and win this one. Really, really big game for the Bears, who also go to 5-1 and are in for the Big 12 title race, definitely competing here this year. Louisiana goes to 5-0. They're into the rankings with a win over Georgia Southern. Florida beats Mizzou. Cincinnati just continues to roll, 48-24 over East Carolina. Ohio State wins a ranked battle with Maryland, 38-20. And the huge storyline here, Indiana knocks off Michigan. The Wolverines just beat Penn State. Maybe they look past this opponent after the big win from last week, a little bit of a hangover. But Indiana, with a late field goal, ends up knocking off the Wolverines 23-21. Alabama 31-13 over Arkansas. Here you can see Bama actually had their backup quarterback Allen come in for Matt Perry, who went out with an injury, and in the third quarter he dominated, 12 for 21, 124 yards and 3 touchdowns. Darion Williams 129 yards on the ground as well. LSU 38-14 over Ole Miss. Remember, Ole Miss made the title game last year. Not going to be doing it this year as they dropped to 4-4. LSU looking like a juggernaut and setting up a likely thunder and lightning clash with Alabama in just a couple weeks. Oklahoma 63-0 over Kansas. Kansas was 4-1 at this point. You thought maybe Kansas could be a huge game for them. Taylor Savage had the first 5 touchdowns, 3 passing, then 2 rushing to push Oklahoma to a 42-0 lead at halftime, and they end up going up for a huge victory. Notre Dame knocks off USC, who falls to 5-2, 17-13. Field goal with 12 seconds left in the game completes the comeback for the Fighting Irish at home. Penn State gets back to winning ways, 31-7 over Rutgers. Cal 17-10 over Oregon State goes and gets a big win there. Washington beats Arizona State, and Wazoo 27-7 dominates Oregon, that looked overmatched, and the Ducks fall to 4-4, so a down year for Oregon up there in Eugene. Players of the week this week, Trey Caldwell, 2 sacks and 2 interceptions for Western Kentucky, who's currently undefeated as they knocked off Old Dominion. And then Nicholas Angle, the junior quarterback for UTSA, the Roadrunners, big game for him, over 300 yards and 5 total touchdowns in a win over Middle Tennessee State. In the ACC, it's Will Alford, 341 yards and 4 TDs in the Tigers' win over Florida State. Ryan Burnett, the junior outside linebacker, in the Cavaliers' win over Duke. 2 sacks, 4 tackles for a loss in that victory. We look at the Heisman race here. Bo Brown, huge game for him in their victory over Ole Miss. Couple of touchdowns there, puts him thick into the Heisman race. Marquez Gordon, Penn State's quarterback, in their victory gets back to winning ways. Big game for him, over 350 yards and 4 total touchdowns. Robert Fry, the Cal halfback, with a nice performance, over 100 yards still. Ja'Shawn McNeil, despite the loss for Florida State, 210 yards and 2 touchdowns for him. And then Ball State's halfback, Justin Martin, currently leading the NCAA in rushing yards, 136 and 3 touchdowns in this game, as Ball State currently sits undefeated on the season. So Despite the Panthers not playing, we'll take a look at the top 25 and see how we moved up in the rankings, hopefully, sitting there at 7-0. You can see the current top 5 is Bama, Ohio State, LSU, Oklahoma State, and Cincinnati. Then you get into some teams with some losses. Clemson sitting there at number 6, 5-1. Penn State at 8. Notre Dame jumps up to 7 with their win over USC, but they have 2 losses, so be tough to see how that resume looks at the end of the year. Washington lurking at number 10. Oklahoma at 9. Remember, they are the defending national champions. And your Pitt Panthers finally getting a little bit of respect, jump from 23 up to 15, sitting on the back of our 7-0 record. So finally, the unbeaten record teams are beginning to the pollsters are beginning to take notice and move Pitt up in the rankings. Baylor with their big win over Iowa State, who fell to 11. Baylor jumps to 17. Cal's up to 18. Louisiana sitting there at 5-0 as well. They're up to number 20 in the rankings. Maryland falls back to 21 after their loss to Ohio State. They'll try to get back on track against Michigan this week. Michigan actually falls to 19 with their loss to Indiana, who does get into the rankings at number 25. You can see North Carolina up to number 23 as well. Western Kentucky up to number 24 and sitting undefeated, and then Indiana at number 25 after that huge upset victory over Michigan. So really big shakeups in the polls. As far as conference play is concerned, Pitt still sitting there at 4-0. Beat Virginia Tech already, beat Virginia already. Miami has 2 losses, so really the only way the Panthers likely miss out on the coastal berth is if they lose to North Carolina in 2 weeks. They have a non-conference game against Coastal Carolina this week that they'll need to focus on. I should say in about 3 or 4 weeks. It'll be Coastal Carolina this week, Georgia Tech, another bye, and then North Carolina. So a few weeks before that big showdown with the Tar Heels, but that's going to be one that may decide the Coastal Division race. Over in the Atlantic, Clemson, pretty much with the inside track. NC State, the only other team with only 1 conference loss. And Clemson, of course, will take them on very, very late on in the season. Final conference game of the season for Clemson. So if NC State loses before then, Clemson will basically walk into the conference title game regardless of that game. But that could come down to be another showdown. So it looks like Clemson, NC State, Pitt, North Carolina, both in the running for their division titles. Pitt, of course, will have a non-conference game this week taking on Coastal Carolina, while North Carolina will actually take on Clemson this week. So that could really throw a wrench into the division race because Pitt won their crossover game earlier in the season against Florida State. North Carolina is going to take on Clemson now. So North Carolina could help NC State out with a win to give Clemson a loss, keep NC State in it regardless. Clemson could really help Pitt out with a victory over North Carolina, giving the Tar Heels 2 losses, which means even a UNC win over Pitt, if Pitt wins the remainder of their ACC games, they would end up in the conference championship. So a lot of outs here, if they say it in the poker terminology. A lot of outs for both the Panthers and the Tigers, depending on the way that game shakes out. NC State, though, will have to compete with a Florida State team that's looked pretty solid this year. Their offense is pretty dynamic, regardless of which quarterback ends up playing for the Seminoles. They could have Shane Parks back from injury or Mike Washington in there. Both quarterbacks very, very talented. Should be an interesting game. Louisiana currently sitting undefeated against Arkansas State, who was a team that was rumored to be on the precipice of joining the Big 12. The Big 12, remember, took Houston and SMU to get up to 12 teams. I should say, 12 teams to bring back their conference championship game. Arkansas State was a team that went undefeated early on before losing in a bowl game, has had really strong squads for the last few years. They're having a bit of a down year, 2-3 at this point this season after some multiple 10-win teams over the course of this dynasty. Oklahoma State 7-0 taking on 5-1 Iowa State. That's one of the biggest games of the weekend. Should be a huge matchup there as far as Big 12 play is concerned. Western Kentucky taking on a decent Troy team to try and stay unbeaten, and then Ohio State and Penn State. Huge showdown. Penn State already with a conference loss to Michigan. Ohio State sitting unbeaten, but still has Penn State to play this week, and Michigan, of course, in their final Big Ten game of the season. So remains to be seen if the Buckeyes can run through that gauntlet of a schedule. They've looked very, very good this season. Their defense is number 14 in the country, offense number 4 in terms of yardage. Penn State has not matched that, maybe doesn't have the talent to match that, but they will have home field advantage, so we'll see if that pays off for them. Michigan looking to bounce back from a disappointing victory. They would have had the inside track to the Big Ten title game had they won last week, because they beat Penn State already. If they beat, Ohio State, they would have been looking very pretty, but unfortunately they lost, fall to 2-2 in conference. Maryland 3-1 right now, so that should be just a tight Big Ten matchup. Oklahoma looking to stay in winning ways right now, 6-1 overall, taking on an upstart Texas Tech team that's sitting at 5-2, but the Sooners should have more than enough to beat them as long as Taylor Savage stays healthy. South Carolina 6-1, very, very strong, taking on Zach Boyd and Missouri, who are struggling right now but have a fairly talented team, so it could be a close game still. Kansas will look to bounce back from that just shellacking they took at the hands of Oklahoma. 4-2 now, taking on a Baylor team. Kansas may be punching a bit above their weight, as their team quality probably doesn't equal the record that they're currently sporting right now. Huge game over in the Pac-12. We really haven't talked about them, I feel like, this year, but Washington, a team that won the college football playoff a few years back, knocked your Pitt Panthers out in season 3 and won the title. They're 7-1 right now. They have Tristan Richards at quarterback, who's unbelievable. Really, really talented player. They're taking on a Cal team that's really surprised this season, and that could be a huge game. Cincinnati hosts SMU in a great matchup where AC Reese and company look to stay unbeaten. Tennessee will go to Bama and have a great rivalry matchup with them. Bama will likely lean on Darion Williams Jr. at tailback, number 4 rush offense against a Tennessee rush defense that's been pretty underwhelming this season. That should be a great showdown. And then we'll get to the big nightcap at Heinz Field. Your Pitt Panthers set to host the Coastal Carolina Chanticleers, their first season, thanks to College Football Revamped, their first season in the Dynasty, their first season at the FBS level, and they've started off very solid, 4-1, 2-1 in the Sun Belt so far. A lot of games backloaded on their schedule, so they'll be pretty busy to the end of the season. You can see they've played 2 less games than our Panthers, but should be a great matchup. Coastal, of course, they run that kind of speed option look. They run the ball really well. Pitt's rush offense is highly ranked in the NCAA, but they've struggled against teams that actually run the ball successfully. Virginia Tech ran the ball well against the Panthers with Eddie Henderson and the like. So if Coastal can lean on that running game, they may give Pitt trouble. But we'll see what they have. Of course, their first season at the FBS level, they have a big loss to Georgia Southern, but beat UTEP, New Mexico, they lost to Georgia State. They beat Georgia Southern, and then they beat Troy. So pretty good schedule. They take on Louisiana, Texas State, App State, Arkansas State. So should be a great schedule for them going through the campaign as we take a look at what they've done so far. And we know they do have some talent. But for your Panthers, just take a look at the leaders in the clubhouse as it stands right now. C.J. Kirk, 1,700 yards passing, 12 TDs, 6 picks. Davion Reynolds is over 100 yards per game on the ground with 6 touchdowns. And, of course, we know what Ceno Rogers provides from a dual threat standpoint, both catching and running with the football. Cedric Granger has 2 picks. Damian Vector has a couple of picks. Jalen Hills leads the way with interceptions. And there we can see the stat line. Grayson McCall, only 766 yards passing in the 5 games so far, but 6 TDs, 2 picks. He takes care of the football, and they have a very solid rushing attack led by C.J. Marable, 529 yards, over 100 per game, and 4 touchdowns for the Chanticleers. Bedgood, their leading receiver, with only 12 catches, but 208 yards. Teron Jackson is their number 1 rated player, as with Marable, McCall, Brewer, and Carter. So 5 guys at 86 overall, but a very well-rated team in terms of they don't have a ton of weak spots. They don't have any 95, 90, whatever overall rated players, but they're very, very solid across the board. Grayson McCall, of course, leads the way. Very good runner, good passer. He's only a redshirt freshman as well, which means he's only going to get better as the season goes on. Completion percentage probably not where he wants it to be, but he runs the ball well. You can see he missed a little bit of time. He's only played in 5 games for them this season, so they've had to rely on their backup quarterback Peyton or I should say they've only played in 5 games this season. Marable right now is their leading runner, but he doesn't have a ton of speed, so interesting to see how they use him, just because his speed is pretty slow. I mean, most of our linebackers could probably outrun him, but he somehow seems to rack up yards, so we'll see how he gets utilized here today. Javon Hiley is their number 1 receiver, very good possession player, 18 catches leads their team, doesn't lead them in receiving yards, but again, we know that they just don't pass the ball a ton. They'll probably use it when they need to, and they definitely don't want to fall behind. If we can get Coastal behind the 8 ball, maybe get a touchdown or 2 lead, force them to pass, maybe get Grayson McCall in some positions where he's uncomfortable, that could probably create some better chances for us. Isaiah Likely is their star tight end. They don't use him nearly enough, that is for sure. 85 overall junior with only single-digit catches right now. Not great there, but they have some talent. Look at that freshman left guard who's 83 overall there. Lampkin. Their whole line is over 80 overall. There's no real weak spots there. We know what Malachi Bordeaux can do in the middle. We know what Jalen Hills can do on the edge. This might even open up things for Mac McAlevey on the other side, just because of the fact that they're going to have to focus on some players we've had that have done really, really well. CJ Brewer's probably the guy to watch for defensively. Impact player, 86 overall. That means that the right side of our line will have a lot to watch out for, but that's where we have the most experience. We got 3 seniors on the right side of the line. I think they'll be able to handle Brewer pretty well when we take them on. They're very thin at the line position as well. Solid defensively. I mean, middle linebacker, outside linebackers, all above 80, mid-80s. Again, like we talked about, no real weak spot to take advantage of. If there's one thing I think we can do well against Coastal here, they don't have a ton of team speed, and that's one thing that, especially offensively for us, we have a ton of. Keith Onyango's a burner for the deep routes. Davion Reynolds, obviously in the backfield, we know what he's able to do. We've seen him take some screens to the house this year. He's just got the breakaway speed. We saw it with that huge run against Virginia Tech there. And then, of course, Cino Rogers. We know what he can do. So that's probably the biggest area where Pitt can take advantage of what Coastal Carolina has available as far as a talent standpoint is concerned, is, I think, team speed, get players in space where they can take the football and just run past these Coastal Carolina defenders. But it should be a great matchup. Of course, Coastal Carolina on their turf, the teal turf, would have been fantastic, but for this season, we're going to have them here at home and get to take on a great new opponent. So, as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think of our recruit signings, as well as who do you think is going to win this matchup here with Coastal. Give me a final score prediction in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. Hail to Pitt. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.